So, yeah, bit of a pithy title, but the goal here is to talk about the future of offensive security. Some of this might be a little controversial in places, but I think the broad points are something that I'm seeing more and more of being made across the industry by quite a few people. So to start off with, I think it's important we look at where we're coming from and where we're at the present. Obviously, it's hard to see where we're going if we're not sure where we are. Then what's changing at the moment? What do I see evolving right now in the industry, and what still needs to change? Because I think there's a fair bit of that too. So as Scott said, I'm our head of research here at WithSecure. My background's mostly in cloud security, but over my 10 years at the business next weekend, I've done pretty much everything we offer at various points. So I've got a fairly broad spread of experience to talk from. So where are we coming from? I mean, in theory, you can trace the first hack back to really early telephone systems in the 1800s, but the industry really kicks off in sort of the late 1980s with the first sort of firewalls, antivirus software, all of these kinds of things. Early 1990s, F-Secure, Data Fellows as it was back then, dropped its first antivirus product, and we've been going in various ways ever since. But the security consulting community, especially the offensive end of it, started professionalizing and sort of solidifying into a something that you could bring into banks without getting laughed out of the house back in the 1990s, right? We grew up out of DEF CON and things like that, and professionalized quite significantly. So call it the 1990s. So that means we've been doing this for 30 plus years, right? Offensive security inside large organizations to try and improve on people's security. How's that working out for us? Well, yeah, I'm not particularly happy with where we're at personally. One of the big ones for me right now is that doing good security costs far too much money. And you often hear people talk about the concept of the security poverty line, this idea that there are loads of organizations out there who just cannot afford to do sensible security. You know, they'll spend a little bit of money on Microsoft Defender, run it on all the endpoints, and that's the end of it. Hell, it might not even be that. It might just be the free antivirus or what have you. And they've got a one-man IT team, and they're still trying to secure their customer data and all these things, right? Because by the time you've piled on all of the different buzzwords, you know, your SIEMs, your EDRs, your CSPM, CWPP, zero trust buzzwords, all of that gets really expensive just to buy the tools in. By the time you then put people on who know what they're doing with it, you know, it's out of reach of all but about the sort of top 1% of organizations, really. And then when all the software as a service firms then charge extra for your audit logs and the various other security features, that then increases the cost even further, especially because various compliance regimes then demand that you have all these things turned on. So the bar to entry to be compliant is super expensive in a lot of cases. And so when you then combine that with the fact that most organizations are working with really quite large piles of technical debt, it gets worse and worse, right? Then the worse the technical debt is, the harder it is to dig yourself out from under it. The more work, the more investment is needed. And as much as there are things you can do, like segregating parts of the network off and stuff to reduce the impact of some of this, that legacy really is a boat anchor around the security of most organizations. Taking a look at Rapid7's data set from 2023, over a third of exploit-based breaches, so you know people exploiting software vulnerabilities, were against perimeter network devices. You know, you've got a VPN or a router or whatever sitting on the edge of your network. And that's what is the route that attackers are taking, right? They exploit these boxes because most of them are running on software that is fully patched and up to date, but the origin of that is probably at least 20 years old. And the developers have been building on cruft after cruft, you know, hacking and bodging things on it. And so we get to the state we're in today where a lot of this stuff is fundamentally engineered to a point where it's incredibly hard to secure properly, especially with the investment that a lot of these firms are willing to make. And if any of you were at RSA, you might have seen Mikko Hyppinen banging on about ransomware. This is the 10-year anniversary this year of the first major ransomware attack. I think the problem's gotten worse, not better, probably over those 10 years. The scale of the ransom demands we're seeing are increasing. The number of organizations getting hit are increasing. And a lot of that is because we can't get the basics right. Rolling out multi-factor authentication properly across a large organization is an incredibly hard and time-consuming thing to do. Likewise, people talk about the principle of least privilege. Personally, it feels like the gold at the end of the rainbow to me, right? You constantly hunt for it. You never get there. People pour tons of money into it. you've got to get your permissions as right as you can, but it really is sort of an 80-20 game, and even getting to the 80% good mark is hard. Segregating old networks is a nice thing to say. Consultants love putting it in reports, but it's not actually very easy to do in most cases. Working out how you can segregate things off and how you split it up is hard. And it turns out even backups are hard at the scale of a medium to large organization, right? Running a full disaster recovery simulation and making sure that it will all actually work when you need it to is, well, clearly beyond the capabilities of many organizations. Otherwise, ransomware wouldn't be such a large problem. But also, there's no real incentive to fund fixing any of this for many organizations. For a lot of the research that's been done, people's stock prices bounce back within an average of 60 days after a major breach. Long term, it doesn't seem to have any major impact on the trajectory of their stock prices, not compared to everything else that happens to a large organization anyway. So if there's no incentive from a monetary perspective for the board and the C-level to get involved and really fix these problems, it's just not going to get fixed. So fundamentally, bit doom and gloom, but I think we failed. We spend all of our time firefighting at the moment, or certainly a lot of it. And a lot of the offensive security engagements that we perform feel like they're somewhat firefighting too. We developed this thing, and now we got to the end of the dev cycle, and now we're going to do a pen test, and okay, great. We'll find a bunch of problems. But we've got to the end of the build process, and now we're doing some security testing. And people have been saying shift left and DevSecOps and all these things for ages, but it's not had as big of an impact, I think, as people would like to see. And the other thing is, I think as an industry, or the offensive end of the industry, really has got to get a handle on all of the open source tooling, commercial off-the-shelf sort of offensive security tooling that we're seeing attackers use. We like building it. It's great fun engineering all this stuff. But you've only got to see what's happened with Cobalt Strike really to see the impacts. Now, I know from talking to some contacts at Cobalt Strike, they're pouring vast amounts of R&D into making sure that their product is harder to abuse like that. But again, they've got tech debt where there's old versions of it lying around. And against your average organization, even the ancient versions from 5 years ago are still very effective. So it's a real problem. And we as the offensive security community have had a hand in it. So what's changing at the moment? Where are things going? As much as the EU seems to like to regulate things to death, actually, in many cases, this is helping. I would say, based on my experiences now, based in the Danish market and seeing a lot of the Nordics, versus my time in the UK previously, CBEST has had a massive impact on the security of the UK banking sector. If you compare an organisation who had their first CBEST engagement, these threat intelligence-led red teams back in 2014 or so, I think it was they first started. Tiber in the Nordics only kicked off maybe 4 years ago. And if I compare a bank in the Nordics who's had one of these engagements versus someone who's had 4 in the UK, the difference in the security posture is really quite noticeable. And so that really is working. And the EU driving DORA, NIS2, the Cybersecurity Resiliency Act, all of these other things, is getting people interested. It's getting these things visible at the board level in a way they've not been before. But it's all driving the cost up. If you've got to do all this to be compliant, you are increasing the cost of doing good cybersecurity. And that's never great. Now, artificial intelligence. I'm mostly going to leave this to Donato because he's far more informed on that topic than I am. But my take on it from what I've seen, there's a lot of noise being made about AI red teaming and breaking the models and all these kinds of stuff. Forget all of that. Leave it to NVIDIA and Google and Microsoft and all the people who are employing whole teams to do just that in a very specialized capacity, and focus on how you're integrating AI into stuff and how you are governing the use of AI within your organizations. And that will get you 90% of the way there for a lot less of the cost than messing around with proper AI pen testing and things, as a lot of people are trying to sell. And at the end of the day, from an offensive perspective, attackers just don't need AI right now. Verizon have done a fair bit of research into this. It's quite clear that phishing attacks are good enough as they are. We don't need AI to help us with it. It might allow us to do more attacks at scale, more targetedly, or in a more targeted fashion rather. But it's fundamentally not necessary. It might change the game from an exploit development front in that you can perhaps move quite a lot faster in that sense. But I don't expect AI to have a massive impact personally in the kinds of things we're seeing organizations get hit with. Most people who get breached by something that didn't need any AI involved in the first place, and that's not going to change. From a cloud perspective, I mean, this is my focus area personally. Like we've been doing this for a long time now. In theory, a lot of this stuff is pretty mature. AWS, Azure, these platforms, but it's expensive to be secure in the cloud. On top of that, we don't have the kind of visibility and introspection that we're used to having on on-premises networks. We can't see what's happening at the very lowest layers of the networking or virtualization stacks. We can get an inventory of what we've got in Azure and another one from what we've got in AWS, but then it turns out our German organization's just gone and bought a load from Stackit, Lidl's little cloud or something like that, and we didn't know about it. So building a central inventory of everything you've got that is on someone else's hardware is incredibly challenging for most organizations. But then on the other side of that, because we're centralizing risk in these organizations, there's then a massive supply chain risk. We've seen this with Okta getting breached, for instance, the single sign-on provider. So there are now areas for attackers to focus that are very profitable, because if you break Okta or one of these other big single sign-on platforms, you get access to an awful lot. But the flip side to that is that we haven't got to worry about patching most of this stuff, right? A lot of people get breached because they haven't patched this box in the corner. The one thing those providers are generally very good at is managing the underlying software stack. You know, a bug gets found, they roll out a fix across the entire fleet. That's a significant improvement on how things used to be on premises, right? But there's a fair bit that still needs to change, I think. We've been trying to kill problems at scale for a long time. Some of this you can see with things like the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge about 5 years back, where they were building systems to automatically patch vulnerabilities in binaries, even when you didn't still have the source code. Things like address-based layout randomization. Let's reduce the risk of kernel exploits. But we need to do more of it, and we need to get much, much better at pushing the capabilities we've developed for desktop and mobile systems, server operating systems, into the embedded space. Because what we often see with devices, all the Internet Things devices, but also cars and anything else running a computer system, they are not hardened to anything like the degree that a modern desktop or mobile operating system is. And we've done a really bad job of secure by default so far. We need to reduce the number of opportunities for a business to shoot themselves in the foot. And the best place to engage with that really is AWS, Azure, the big SaaS providers, Microsoft 365, Salesforce. You know, they are the ones we really need to drive that push, because they're in the position to have the largest impact. But again, that means their customers have got to demand it off them. And at the moment, they haven't been to the degree that you'd expect. Legacy is perhaps not quite the right word here, but there's a lot of workloads that are critical to the continued function of our economy and our society that are running on technology that is poorly understood from a security perspective. Mainframes and sort of operational technology, industrial control systems, this sort of stuff are the obvious cases, but there's definitely more. They're poorly understood by attackers because it's quite hard to get your hands on one of these things to test. The startup costs of doing so are quite high. But that also means we're not breeding defenders in the same way that we are for cloud or for mobile or other things that someone can very easily get their hands on with a credit card and a couple of $100, right? So that also needs to change. We need to work out how, as an industry, we can scale both the research into how you attack these things, and also then how do we defend against all of that in a way that makes it available to power companies and organizations who historically haven't invested in security for a whole variety of reasons, but we need to get there now. A lot of the assessment approaches we currently take, I think, are outdated in many ways. Paper-based audits are necessary. We can't get away from them. They're a compliance-driven thing. But at the end of the day, they fundamentally often don't reflect the reality on the ground. So they're great for driving compliance. I'm not convinced they're good for driving proper security in many cases. The whole point-in-time penetration testing model, I reckon, has been broken for probably about 10 years now. We've been trying to move away from it in various ways, but so many of the compliance standards and everything else still demand that you have a tick box point-in-time pen test, that convincing organizations to move to more effective models is proving really challenging. So we need to get all of the organizations driving these compliance standards to get on board with better ways of doing this, right? And that will help drive the price down too for a lot of it. And red teaming, there are organizations who can absolutely benefit from it. Like I say, CBEST has done wonders for the UK banking sector, but 95% of organizations aren't mature enough to get the value out of them. But a lot of people hear about it. It's the buzzword. You go to security conferences and everyone's talking red teaming. So the CISO comes along and says, oh, yes, I need a red team. And well, do you really? Actually, no, you need these 7 things first. And then once you've fixed everything that's come out of all of that for half the price of a red team, then we can start talking about whether a red team's right, and that, again, helps drive the cost down if we can help people understand that. So where does offense fit in? Offense exists to support defense. The industry's been very good historically at doing a whole bunch of offensive research, finding a bunch of bugs, dropping the mic on stage in Las Vegas and walking away, leading the defenders to it. But that's not what we're there for. The industry has matured to the point where most people understand it, but we need to drive it harder, right? We need to be there doing the research to understand where the vulnerabilities and weaknesses are so that we can help defenders improve their situation. That's the whole point of offense. There's a variety of ways we can do that, but that does need to be the core focus. And at the end of the day, we do need to remember where security sits in the bigger pyramid. A lot of the time, especially the offensive end of the industry, gets in its own head about how important it is in the grand scheme of things. We exist to support the business. Security is a cost center. We need to do everything with that in mind and enable the business to move faster and move more safely, and do it with that model on. How we bring business value, because just by existing, security costs money, right? We need to be enablers. We need to be engaged inside the engineering teams, working with the engineers to help them out. And I say shift everywhere these days, right? The whole shift left thing was nice, but we should be in every part of the life cycle, from the requirements definition right the way through to the maintenance after it's released, right? That's how we have the most effect. And the earlier you catch something, obviously, the cheaper it is to fix too. I think we're going to see technologies harmonize. I think seams and a lot of these very security specific engine software will go away. We'll move to using the same tech stacks that a lot of developers are using. They're all processing logs. What's the difference fundamentally? A lot of organizations are paying twice for what is essentially the same feature set. And as I say, offense informs defense. So where do we go from here? What's up next? I think there's a few things we need to focus on, really. One of the big ones is that a lot of the offensive industries likes talking about stuff at conferences, but the amount of information that actually gets out there in terms of real concrete things that can be absorbed by those who aren't at the conference or aren't already operating on that level is not as broad as it should be, right? We need to be out there sharing the knowledge that we've got, and I think consultancies in particular need to get better at doing that. There's a few key focus areas in terms of developing our ability to help from an offensive perspective. AI is one of the big ones, but I'll let Donato talk about that. Key areas of more traditional technology stacks as well. SaaS and cloud, purely because of the amount of data that's up there. And then improving our ability to do threat simulation in a cost-effective way for businesses that can't afford red teams. We need to get better at working at scale, enabling organizations to do more with less. There's a constant push on budgets. The more we can do with a given amount of money, the better security we get, right? So we need to look at developing new approaches to better support that. We need to prioritize and help organizations prioritize where to put their money. There's always loads and loads of marketing buzz hitting LinkedIn about the latest problems and quantum cryptography and all these other things. A lot of organizations don't have the expertise in-house to work out which of the 17 things on LinkedIn this week they should be chasing. What should they be focused on? So we need to get better at helping people with that. And from an offensive perspective, again, we need to drive the defense end of things. That's what we're here for. So there we go. I think, have we got time for a question or two? Or fantastic. Yes.
You talked about the point in time, pen test was, being pen tested since 2010, so no what. So question is, what's the solution there? Sorry.
No, absolutely. Well,
did you get a more continuous pen test?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends an awful lot. This is one of those questions that's so dependent on organization culture and what the engineering teams and IT teams are doing, but it's hard to come up with a prescriptive answer. We've had a fair bit of success engaging in a way where you essentially have a low level of pen testing effort consistently over the life cycle of a project. And so as new features get developed, they get picked up, and you test individual pieces as they come through. And at least in my experience, that gets you a lot of the benefit in the long term, because then the engineers are seeing what you're testing as you go, what you find, and it builds a positive feedback loop, so you find less in the future too. That's one place I'd start on this. Kind of, yeah. Yes, in many respects, yeah. Certainly that's one approach I've seen.
I was really trying to understand how to do that continuous pen testing. So it might be better in terms of the automation, having the process of automation. So, yes.
No, that's fair. Automation will certainly help, but a lot of it is just sitting a pen tester next to a dev as they're building this stuff. In my experience, we've had a lot of success with that, I think.
Best test models very expensive.
It certainly can be. It depends on how you're engaging with it, I think. It's also the kind of thing where that prioritization factor comes in. You probably don't want to be doing that on every dev project, but there's probably key dev projects within the organization that will benefit significantly from it, where you can see that this particular aspect's got the crown jewels. So let's focus here. Let's prioritize the investment over there. And I think we also need to get better as an industry to compensate for that at identifying what actually is a risk. It's not uncommon for us to get pulled into a pen test on an app where we sit down on the first day and I go, okay, so what's the business impact if I get code execution or SQL injection here? And the answer is, not sure, not much. This hasn't really got any sensitive data, but we've still got to tick the box. Well, exactly right.
I think your ashes list of threat and the application tasks and
exactly. So as an example, we just wrapped up a massive engagement for a Danish financial organisation when they brought us in to do essentially their entire pension stack. But we got there to discover that's, I don't know how many applications. Step one was do a ton of threat modelling with all the teams, work out what actually matter, and then de-scope probably 75% of what we originally came in to look at, because so much of it was reliant on the security of a few key pieces. But actually, so long as we got those bits right, we could be reasonably assured of the rest of
it.
Right now, incredibly difficult to do purely because the regulators don't like it. And so there's a journey for us to go on as an industry to convince the regulators that that is an approach that can work. Yeah, go on.
It feels like there's a problem across the board there with the incentives.
Yes.
Kind of offensive security being like, oh, I got a Vegas fund and drop my sword and I got to illness and it's going to be a couple of, I get the clout. But, and then security vendors are incentivized to make money and that satisfy their like basic acumen, so they do that. And then all of it is not incentivized apart from regulation to do anything about security unless it's cost of mind that they make money or damage trust. So I think I'd be interested in your opinion. So what do you think if you went down to the offensive security layer and said, do you think there's a place for it? And what would it be when it comes to...
Oh, that's a Pandora's box, isn't it? No, absolutely. So my take on it is that if we try, especially in the context of the Western world, if we try and regulate like offensive security tooling releases and all the rest of it, what will happen is that the skill base in the West will decrease relative to what's happening in the rest of the world, where China, Russia, Iran, whoever else does not care, right? They're not going to regulate it. So it would be nice if we could fix that. But fundamentally, I don't see how you can do that sensibly. And I'm getting 2 more questions. 2 minutes. Okay, fantastic. We got one left.
You said that there's only 5 people that could find about the red team. It's us. What are the key points? There's something to do that review at the moment with red team.
So my answer to that is there's a book called Red Team by Micah Zenko, where he's engaged with a whole load of people who've done red teaming from the US Marine sense through to the cyber sense to everything else. And there's a common thread of themes of why these things fail and what you need in an organization to be able to get maximum value out of them. So the blunt answer is read that, because I can't summarize it in the next 2 minutes. But I think the couple of key things are you need to be in a position where you're fairly sure of your prevention. You've already exercised your detection. You know that your detections mostly work as you think they do. You've got a mature program in place for improving that, and you have an instant response capability. Because the point of a red team in a cyber context is to simulate the end-to-end thing. So if you don't know your prevention's in place, you don't know that you can detect stuff, and you don't know that you can respond to it if you do detect it, then there's no point in doing the through simulation. Red Team by Micah Zenko. Fantastic. And I'll wrap it up with that and hand over to Donato.